because I'd like to talk to you about why it is that the left, particularly in the last 30 years, hasn't been able to take in this understanding and develop a politics to respond to it, or what do you think needs to be done? Do you have time to have that conversation?
I don't think I have another full hour, but I can probably go for like another half hour if that works.
Okay, let's do that.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Jamie Merchant lives in Chicago and is currently writing a critique of contemporary political economy for the Field Notes book series. And today we're going to talk about Marx's labor theory of value, finance capital, and the new nationalism that has emerged on both the left and the right. Specifically, we'll be discussing his essay for the Brooklyn Rail entitled Fantasies of Secession, a Critique of Left Economic Nationalism. But Jamie, welcome to the Sublation Media podcast, Diet Soap. And I should ask at the start, is that bio, which I lifted pretty much from the Brooklyn Rail, is that still accurate? Are you still working on that book? Or is it out?
Oh, definitely still working on it. Yeah, definitely not out.
Okay.
But it's going to encapsulate both that article that you mentioned and some of the more recent stuff I've been doing, which are basically adaptations of parts of the book.
Okay, great. So here's where I'm going to start. I'm going to try to set this in this particular moment. It's March 24th, 2022, and right now I think that on the right there are lots of fears of what the World Economic Foundation calls the Great Reset. Many are obsessed with banks and bankers, blaming them for all manner of social problems. They're blamed for COVID, the long-standing economic crisis, and even Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, some on the left are embracing the dream of financial nationalization and imposing state control over the financial sector. Although with the death of the Bernie Sanders campaign, that dream has pretty much died at the moment, it seems like. But what does this left and the social democratic left and the right share in common? And what are the assumptions at work that need to be questioned and overturned?
Well, I think the thing that they share in common in the most basic level is the idea that we could reorganize like U.S. society and other national economies on the basis of some kind of pure democratic ideal, where we return all economic power to the population. We take all the wealth away from the financiers and the bankers. We redistribute it, fairly to the citizens of the country, to the specific individual country in question. And then maybe we run if you're on the left, we run the financial system along democratic lines where we have some form of popular input, collective input on where we want to invest resources, how we want to, allocate and distribute capital, basically just how we want to redistribute the wealth and in what way. Or if you're on the right, perhaps you're working with some sort of more directly populist, like small business kind of ideal where we just need to deconstruct, like Bannon used to say, deconstruct the administrative state, reduce whatever, get government out of civil society, which for him, also includes the bankers, because it's this kind of it's the globalist right encroachment on American society. So we have to detach from all of that and get back to the kind of, the roots of what makes America great, however they define it. And usually it boils down to some kind of community, localist kind of what the older tradition would have called petty bourgeois idea. So it's that same idea. It takes different forms on both the left and the right. But what they get wrong is that we can't just rewind the clock back to a time before before global finance was this huge, monstrous planetary apparatus that directs the wealth and the capital of the world all around the globe extremely quickly in this extraordinarily complex infrastructure that has kind of emerged piecemeal over the last 20 years or so. That all of that could be just kind of reset, as it were, to use your word, to use their word, and to go back to this like nostalgic vision of what social democracy, 20th century social democracy, or whatever, like Gilded Age America, whatever. Pick your dystopian right wing vision, but the idea that we could just rewind it, right, and go back to one of those, I want to argue is a very misguided idea, basically. For a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I've done some study of this, probably not as extensively as you, but since World War II, there's been a consensus that's emerged that financial monopolies had already overcome the contradictions inherent to free market capitalism. And along with that idea on the left, there's sort of this right-wing fear of this managerial elite that's overcome capitalist competition. So like James Burnham wrote about the managerial revolution back in 1941, and warning against it. But it seems to me that what you're claiming is that the emergence of a class of managers, along with that, which goes hand in hand with the sort of financialization of the world, it does not indicate that capitalism has been overcome. Productive capitalism has been overcome, and it doesn't mean that. What that also means is that the problems that arise are not, exclusively the fault of mismanagement. So how did financial capitalism, as we know it, arise? And I guess maybe I'll throw in how is it that so many on the left and the right confuse that development with the overcoming of capitalism itself?
You mean to say how do they confuse the rise of a kind of managerial class with the kind of resolution of capitalism's contradictions or something like that?
Right. That's right. But I mean, on the right, I think there's a nostalgia for the free market, for free competition, and for the old days of entrepreneurial bootstrapping. And so on the right, there's a desire to kind of return to capitalism, that capitalism has been thwarted. And on the left, there's both a fear and a hope that the management of capital through financial institutions and the state has overcome the contradictions that Marx would say was inherent to capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, on the idea that we can return to the like competitive, like smaller market-based capitalism of an earlier era. I mean, that's also not just on the right, or maybe it's just always at this point in history a inherently like sort of decadent right-wing idea. But you see it on people who claim that they argue for the left too. I mean, there are think tanks like the Open Markets Institute, for instance, is one which which claims to be on the left, as sort of like populist, democratic program, but is always arguing that we just need to break up monopolies, right? Like we just need to break up the big tech monopolies, the financial monopolies, and the banks, and so on, and that will allow for this like democratic, this democratic restoration of popular power, and they claim to be on the left. So it kind of fluctuates there on the political spectrum, that vision. But then, I mean, the idea that the sort of left idea you're describing, that we can I suppose manage away the the way that capitalism works as a system, both like nationally and globally. I mean, that's the Keynesian gambit, right? The idea that if you have the right people in power with the right ideas, and you have the right theories and the right kind of like scientific tools, you can manage the economy in this like kind of hydraulic fashion, where you are controlling these variables over here, and you are, so that they will have, like for instance, like a multiplier effect on the broader economy, create jobs and so on, without leading to runaway inflation. Like, you're going to just regulate it just so that the internal tensions of the capitalist mode of production don't get out of hand, and don't lead to like some big explosive crisis. That's what they thought they had accomplished, like you're saying, in the middle of the 20th century. And up until the early to mid to late 70s, and I know you're familiar with this history, right? But up until that theory, ran aground, in the fully global stagflationary, what they look back and call stagflation, but inflationary crisis that basically engulfed all of the capitalist countries more or less simultaneously up through the 70s, and was only really defeated once Paul Volcker implemented his crazy spike in American and so eventually global interest rates in the early 1980s, when they reached like historic levels that they have never reached since. And so it became clear at that time that the original Keynesian idea that you could nationally, I mean, Keynes himself was aware that you couldn't do this purely from a national perspective. You had to have like a larger kind of like international, infrastructure in place that would regulate the flows of capital and the balance of trade between different countries and keep it within an equilibrium. So he was aware of the problem. But in any case, the idea that you could just more or less nationally regulate your national economy in this kind of scientific way that I was describing, and avoid all of those problems, was blown apart by the crisis of the 70s, when all of the capitalist economies entered this crisis at the same time. And so the way that great crisis was resolved was partly through the gigantic spike in world interest rates and the enormous destruction and devaluation of capital that caused, and the enormous layoffs and impact on human life and the working class that led to. In addition to all of the machinery and plant and so on, that was the old factories that were devalued when that crisis happened. And that then sort of set the stage for, along with like floating exchange rates between currencies, the dropping of the gold standard, the liberalization of capital flows between countries, all of these kinds of things opened up the space for a new kind of, globally, financially integrated capitalism, what eventually became what we called globalization. Mm-hmm. And that, in conjunction with the great devaluation, that the really deep depression that hit the capitalist economies in the late 70s and 80s, opened up space for economic growth, while there was this financial expansion happening at the global level. Mm. And this was able to carry on, basically through get going in the 80s, sort of pick up steam in the 90s, during the roaring 90s, when everyone thought that the new economy was going to be the next big thing. And that was the stock market was going to keep going up and up and up. And everyone would be able to be, an investor and so on. That obviously ran aground and collapsed when the dot-com bubble happened. And then, of course, the 2008 collapse sort of put paid to that idea. And then that crisis then led into the trajectory that we're in now, which we can talk more about if you want. But that's kind of how I see that history unfolding.
Yeah. One of the things about, I was in my 20s in the 90s. And so one of the things about that era is that it's worth remembering that as much as we look back on it as like the roaring 90s, a period of great economic growth, and which it was also still a time period where a lot of the complaints that millennials have made, and that maybe Zoomers are going to start making soon, were still being made by Generation X. We had McJobs to look forward to. We had a future that was not going to be as well. We weren't going to be as wealthy as our parents had been. That this was all in the air in the 90s. So even in the Clinton era, there was a feeling of underlying instability and decline, I think, during the 90s. So just throw that out there.
Yeah. That's a good reminder, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was only for some that that the economy was working even then. I mean, and there's always been young people in the working class who have to struggle, and it was not the boom that, at least, I don't know, I wasn't around the 50s, but it was not the boom that we were being sold that the 50s was. It did not feel like that. The memory of the 80s was pretty fresh still, and so on.
Yeah. For sure. I think one difference, if I could just add too, was that like in the 90s, as long as it seemed like the kind of the elite's preferred narrative about like how the new economy was working sort of seemed remotely plausible, right, to like at least a broad enough section of the populace, then those kind of complaints that you're describing like didn't really they couldn't catch on as widely as they then later did, maybe. But once the 2008 crash happened, and I mean the whole house of cards looked like it was going to come down, the elites were kind of forced to question, okay, we actually are not doing something right. And they themselves began to question that narrative about globalization, right? And whether or not it worked as they thought. And then that in turn kind of opened space for like different narratives to gain more salience, maybe. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. The other thing is, like, just not to harp too much on the history, but in both elections, the question of globalization was dominant, and there was, like, Ross Perot's campaign, for instance, was run on a kind of a nationalistic basis against the globalizers, and the on the left, the anti-WTO movement, which didn't just arise out of nowhere in 1999, but had been building up throughout that decade, again, was like trying to tamp down neoliberalism, which was connected to Reaganism in most young people's minds. And so the fear of the financial sector, and the feeling that certainly the developed world, but also even young people and everyday people at home, were kind of under the foot of big finance, was pretty dominant even in the 90s, even though that's not the story that we kind of were sold at the time, or what we necessarily walk away with. But you can see hints of it, and especially in the anti-WTO movement.
For sure.
So what I want to ask you now is something sort of like basic, like, what is financial capital exactly? How does it emerge? What is it there for? I mean, we know it's banks, and they loan money, and they set interest rates and all that, but what is it within the circuit of capitalism? What is financial capitalism doing, and why is it necessary?
So financial capital, it plays an integral role within, like, what Marx described as the circuit of capital, the circuit of industrial capital, in volume 2 of that book. And it essentially serves, I mean, there he's talking about money capital, commercial capital, productive, et cetera. But the basic idea, if you think about the circuit on the global level, is that you have productive capital, which are forms of capital investment that employ commodified labor, wage forms of labor that, produce value, from which surplus value can be extracted, and which then can flow into the bank accounts once of the companies who employ them, once they sell the products and services the workers create for more money than they put in at first. And that extra money then flows, right? It doesn't just sit in a vault somewhere. It flows into a deposit, which is typically at a bank, or now increasingly in more arcane, weird, not necessarily traditional bank institutions that make up the global financial system, right? The money that they produce through productive labor, through employing productive labor, exploiting it, flows into ultimately the institutions that make up the global financial system, with which all the industrial corporations, the manufacturing corporations, all the other sectors of the economy are plugged into, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially financial capitalism or financial capital I think can best be understood as a pool of capital that's produced by all of the independent capitalist producers in this way, that kind of flows into a common pool that is now fully global, that is part of a fully interconnected international financial system, and that then they can all independently draw upon for credit in order to expand their operations, to invest in new technology, to hire new armies of workers for new forms of investment in different parts of the world. It serves as a common credit fund that the capitalist class as a whole, right? Where in a sense, like, all of their profits are kind of socialized in a weird way. This is what Marx talks about in Capital Volume 3, right? It's sort of like it's kind of like the socialization of capital on the basis of the capitalist mode of production. I think he uses some phrase like that. And so that's the kind of essential role it plays in reproducing, and expanding individual capitals. And so, in aggregate, the capitalist mode of production as a whole. And so ideally, right, it will do this in the most efficient, it will allocate these resources in the most efficient possible way, moving them to where, profit opportunities are highest, where market actors can get the best return for their investments, the best revenue for their spending, and so on. And that way the whole system can grow as within an equilibrium. But as we know, it doesn't really work like that. There are all kinds of irrationalities and problems and inconsistencies that make that not an accurate description of the way that the global financial system works. So financial capitalism, right, I would say, is the name of the form of global capitalism we've been living under for roughly the last 30 years or so, where the enormous profits, which is one form of surplus value that surplus value takes, in addition to interest and rent and all the rest of it, are increasingly congealing in this common pool within the world's financial institutions without sufficient outlets for productive investment to flow into. And so that would be profitable enough, right, to justify that over just investing in some kind of new speculative asset, or cryptocurrencies, or NFTs, or whatever you like. So as long as that's the case, we're going to continue to see this giant surplus of financial capital, basically what Marx called money capital, just continuing to expand and grow and get bigger, while the basic kinds of investment that would allow society and our communities to reproduce themselves at a humane level, to continue to languish, because it's not profitable enough for capital to invest in anymore, for private capital. So that's a quick and dirty definition of how I would come at financial capitalism. And obviously there's way more to it in terms of how it shapes our lives, right? Like how it transforms our experience of work, how it changes the way people think about the economy and about politics. I mean, there's all of those questions too, but just the very a kind of rough and ready description of how it operates as a configuration of global capitalism, that's what I would offer.
Well, how is the expansion of financial capital and money capital connected to debt? And also, let me throw in another thought at the same time, complicate this a little. And to what extent does that expansion of financial capital actually represent an expansion of wealth? I mean, and by that I don't just mean useful commodities, sensuous useful commodities, but also the power to produce, the power to employ. It seems as though you can have, I mean, just theoretically, you could have a massive expansion of money capital just by printing money and creating inflation. And that will expand the amount of money capital in the world without really expanding the power of the capitalist class or real wealth. So, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, when we talk about the expansion of financial capital, should we think of it as sort of a disease, as a problem, rather than as a, I don't know, some sort of trick that the bankers are pulling? Like, oh, they're taking all the money that could be used on for us, for themselves, whereas what they have is actually not real wealth. Does that make sense? Am I being clear?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of real wealth, you have in mind just like real investment in real resources, like use values, basically stuff that
use values. Well, one of those use values would be labor itself, right? I mean, the ability to reproduce capital and to expand the reach of capital, so to employ more people, to proletarianize more people, and to produce more commodities. Or even if you're not going to produce like more commodities, let's say you produce more value, you produce commodities that have real value, rather, whereas if you're just moving money around between NFTs and stocks and I don't know what other kind of, cryptocurrencies or whatever it is, it seems like that is maybe mostly empty, especially if you have the currencies inflating.
Yeah. I mean, so finance creates fabulous amounts of wealth, I would say, but it's paper wealth, right? And it does this because what it works with are basically securities, right? And I go into this in great detail in like my most recent piece for the Rail, which if your viewers are interested, they can check out. But the financial security is based on what Marx called, the way it's valued, right, is what Marx referred to as fictitious capital, where you buy something, like you invest in an asset, and that, like, you purchase like a bond or a stock or any other kind of security, and the way that it acquires a value is by the kind of expectations leading into the future of all of the payments that you're going to receive, right? Like over the next however many years, however many months, in some cases even decades, right? And those expectations then are kind of like folded backward, as it were, into the price of the security, which can be like many, many magnitudes larger than what it can actually like produce in terms of a sustainable, like, long-term revenue stream, or much less like value and like profit in kind of like Marxist sense. And so it's built around the security, the financial system, the entire thing, right? Like government bonds, like stocks, corporate bonds, like every other kind of derivatives, like every other kind of object that is bought and sold within the financial system is built around security, and the way that its price is based on what's called capitalization, right? This kind of like bringing future value back into the present. And so that in and of itself, right, like creates an enormous expansion of purely financial, like, i.e. paper wealth, that fills up the balance sheets of the world's financial institutions, of banks, of obviously like hedge funds, like private equity funds, even government balance sheets, right? Insofar as they invest in these things. And so that alone leads to that kind of dynamic. And that whole dynamic in turn obscures, right, the difference between profit, like a form of surplus, the different forms of surplus value, insofar as it just says everything is about the capitalized, the price of securities as capitalized revenue, based on expectations about what's going to happen in the future.
Mm.
And so obviously the role of profit, surplus value in maintaining the capitalist system is obscured from view, right? If that's how you understand what wealth and profits are. And that is indeed how they understand it. And so it can lead, and what that means is that once this kind of settles into place as the main paradigm for attempting to grow the rest of the economy, right? Like relying on the ever steadily rising values of financial assets, right? Their prices, basically, of stocks and all the rest of it. Then that becomes very important. That upward momentum becomes, absolutely critical to maintain for the health of the broader system. And that's why, we can get into these kinds of questions too if you want in more detail, but that's why we see the government financial institution, the government, like the monetary institutions, like the treasuries and the central banks of the major capitalist powers, like increasingly involving themselves administratively in all kinds of ways in the mechanics of the financial system, because they have to keep this thing going. They have to keep the values expanding and the general price level of the assets rising, or else because that's where they kind of come down out of a result of kind of like pragmatic experimentation over the last decade or so of like, okay, this is the mode in which we're going to govern the economy, basically is through this kind of financial manipulation. So they have to, it's a necessity that they sort of have to continue involving themselves in all of this, and the mechanics and the plumbing of the system to keep it going up. So to answer your question, or to put a bow on it, it's fabulously wealthy, and it makes people incredibly rich. But as we know, like that, that wealth is very precarious and it can disappear very quickly. And capitalist states and the people who run them are very aware of that. And they're aware of the threats to their legitimacy that can create if a crash is big and deep enough. And so they are going to do their utmost to prevent that scenario from coming about, and just continue allowing the expansion of paper wealth, basically, to keep going.
Now, just I want to walk through this again with you here, just to be as clear as I can be in my own mind. The idea here is that you create this paper wealth, and you make it mobile, and you make sure that the paper wealth is mobile. It can be put anywhere around the globe, so that capitalists who are in the productive sector or other financial capitalists can get a hold of it and invest.
Ideally,
it can, and it needs to be fictitious because, in order to reproduce capitalism, like let's say you have a business that's making widgets. In order to keep making widgets, you can't just rely on the profits from last year. You have to keep getting loans to reinvest into the continued production of these widgets. But you're doing that on the basis of getting a return and being able to pay off those loans, right? And so then you have this elaborate financial system that emerges to continually speculate about the future success of productive capital, right? And wildly inflates the predictions of the productive capital, the success of productive capital, but nonetheless creates enough paper wealth and obscures what's happening enough so that the financial sector can maintain its power to influence and control what is produced. And those people, let's say, who are either in the more developed wealthy nations or part of the capitalist class, can use the money that they have to get whatever real wealth is being produced. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But then the problem is that there's still a shortfall. There's still a lack of profitability. There's still debt, and that debt gets kind of shoved around as it's like a hot potato. It's not our problem. It's your problem over here. We're going to move it from the housing sector into the state. We're going to move it from the U.S. state into the Chinese state if we can, or vice versa. Is that kind of what's going on right now? Is that
I mean, definitely. Well, I do think the geopolitical competition, then the escalating aggression we're seeing, I mean, like sort of barring the outright heinous war that's happening in Europe right now, but like the escalating trade war, right, between, like, for instance, China and the United States, is based on basically trying to determine who's going to pay the costs for a system that no longer grows sufficiently for all of the major countries of the global economy to grow together.
right?
And so in that sense, you do have the United States trying to cut China off from, right, like, critical resources that they would need to continue developing their economy in a technologically complex way, like, semiconductors and microprocessors and components like that, which, if they're successful in doing, right, like, obviously that will force the PRC government to continue to rely on, like binges of debt and credit-based stimulus to for instance, like the state-owned enterprises with whom the government is very close, to drive that kind of, like, bubble-driven growth within China, right? So in that sense, it's definitely like the politics of debt are at play. I would slightly revise what I was saying earlier about the financial wealth and so on. It's not that it's entirely unproductive, right? Like, this is what it is and it isn't, right? This is where it gets sort of tricky. Like, when like a bank lends capital, or more accurately, gives credit, right, to a productive enterprise of some sort to invest and to expand its operations, that company will expand its operations, will potentially hire, right, like more labor, like upgrade its machinery and equipment. Maybe it both moves into a higher kind of form of automated production, and it still hires more workers, right? Like, if it's like a really productive, like, new sector of production. And so it's going to be so in that sense, it will be producing more value, right? In the productive capital sense. But the financial sector does not itself, like, produce that value, right? Like, it will take a cut of the value that the producing company produces, that it creates, and it's in the form of the interest payments, right?
Right.
But it's not purely parasitic, is what I'm trying to get at, right? It's like it does facilitate the expansion and reproduction of capital, but it does it indirectly, and it does not itself create any new value, right?
Right. Yeah. And I wasn't trying to imply that it was just.
Oh no, I know. I was correcting myself. Like, I was,
yeah, okay.
or just revising what I said.
Yeah. So okay. So so the difficulty here is that it seems like the expansion of the power of the financial capital has to do with the failure to meet those expectations, which then drives, like, wild speculation in order to justify the extension of credit. It's like, that's like, you can think about it, like, you have a drug addicted sibling who keeps going to mom and dad to borrow more money. It's like, I'm going to go to college. Don't worry. I'm going to get my act together anytime now. And it's like, okay, well, we'll give you this time how much you need. It's sort of that, that situation is going on. And the consequence of that is, as we said, the debt, or who's gonna really suffer the consequences of the failure to meet those expectations, is shoved around within a country, like between the classes and the sectors, and also internationally, right? So that's what we're dealing with. But right now, it seems like the U.S. debt, or the U.S. financial power, is really central to all sorts of capitalist sectors around the globe, in China and
Mhm.
India and Russia and wherever else, really. And um, and it's important to keep in mind that like the problem is not the financial sector; it's the fact that when these loans are made, that the expectations are too high, that they right and they're too high because of the underlying problem in production. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
what would the consequence be of saying to the U.S., okay, actually, no, you've been lending this money, you've been creating this debt, you're going to have to be the one who defaults. You're going to be the one who has to face the consequences. This is what could it be contained to one country to pay the costs? And also, um, is this problem what's driving the desire to nationalize everything, to try to, like, are we all just trying to get out from under this massive international
Mhm.
difficulty?
Mhm. Yeah, the scenario you're describing, I think, is sort of analogous to the what was seen as kind of like a nightmare scenario with U.S. policymakers and government elites in the early 2000s, like leading up to 2008. Right, you had China buying enormous amounts of U.S. debt, of like Treasury bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds, right?
Mhm.
And basically just recycling their enormous industrial profits from their manufacturing companies, into their central bank, and then using that money to get dollars and then exchange for dollars and then buy Treasury bonds. There was this kind of nightmare scenario that China was one day going to weaponize those holdings and demand, basically just sell all of the bonds and crash the dollar, basically, and and cripple the U.S. economy. So not a default like you're describing exactly, but basically sort of calling the U.S.'s bluff, or in some sense. That's not how it turned out historically, of course, for different reasons. But yeah, but as far like could something like that, I mean, if something like that happened, or if the U.S. defaulted, if it was in some situation where it was going to default, I mean, I think it's hard to imagine, because it's so, I mean, it's the DNA of the globe, of the way the whole global, not just the financial system, but I would argue, like, a great deal of the productive infrastructure of the world economy works. It's so tied to the dollar. It's so, and the dollar is such a central currency for making the whole thing work. And in addition to that, U.S. debt is absolutely central to making the whole thing work. Like, the U.S. Treasury bonds they play a central function in serving as safe assets for banks, for corporations, for other governments around the world to invest in and buy and hold, right, in order to provide kind of like a bottom line for their accounts, in the way that gold used to before the end of the gold standard. The U.S. Treasury bond, and sort of like just the dollar now in general, serves the role really as kind of like the global safe asset that gold, like the bottom line of the global money system, the way that gold used to, arguably. And so it's very hard to imagine a situation where everyone, like all these different actors who rely on the value of the dollar and the value of U.S. debt for their for just basically their financial existence, to see themselves as benefiting from a default on the U.S. side. But that doesn't mean, I guess that doesn't mean it's impossible. So, I mean, where could it be contained? I mean, like, yeah, if everyone was just if we were just to renounce, all of the enormous national debt that the U.S. has incurred over the last like 30 or 40 years, could it be contained? We're just like speculating here, but it'd be a cataclysmic event were that to happen. And suffice to say, I don't think that the U.S., like the citizens of this country, would be would be unaffected by it. I mean,
well, yeah, sure, but
yeah.
I'm actually asking about, would China and Chinese citizens be unaffected by it? What would it do?
Oh, they would definitely be affected by it. Yeah.
Yeah, it would undermine international capital in general, right? For that to happen.
Yeah, it would. I mean, it would. And in some ways, we're already moving towards. People make the argument that we're in some ways moving very slowly towards a kind of like post-dollar hegemony world.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that countries like China do want to, and obviously Russia would love to get out from under the dollar in the sense that they would prefer to be using their own currencies or some other form of monetary standard where they're not so in thrall, right, to U.S. financial power and its currency. But it's very slow, and it definitely is happening very, very, very gradually. And something like what you're describing, it would kind of accelerate that process that is arguably already happening. Where some people refer to, some commentators will refer to as like the deglobalization and like the kind of regionalization of the global economy that we might be moving into. Yeah.
When you talk about this on the level of politics rather than on the level of finance, that what they say is we don't want a unipolar world, we want a multipolar world, right, with spheres of influence.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll hear people on the right and sometimes the left, it doesn't really matter, say, oh yeah, what this is all about is the weakness of the US dollar, the need for Russia and China to get out from under. I mean, I actually had like a Trump supporter Q guy send me a message saying, oh, what this is really about is, the bankers trying to manipulate Russia through the dollar. I was like, okay. It's like, weren't you supposed to be the big, West is best, U.S.
We live in strange times.
Yeah. It's like, what the fuck is this? But so what I wonder is, let's say that we could imagine a situation where like the ruble becomes what's supposedly the safe place to put invest your money into where I guess to hold the debt. It's the ruble is holding the debt. Is that how to think of it? The dollar's holding the debt. The ruble would be holding the debt. Is that kind of what it would be?
It serves as like universally accepted collateral, basically, for loans. So yeah,
right.
So it fuels debt. It fuels credit creation.
Right. So okay, so if that were to happen, wouldn't there be in the process of that just a massive devaluation? I mean, wouldn't the effect be that now? It wouldn't be like all the assets that were being held, the productive assets that were being held, would have the same value, or that it would be, or that I would think you would have massive inflation in some areas as a consequence of that. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to put the pieces all together here, but like during the 2008 crisis and after, around 2011, Greece was suffering a terrible depression, and they were talking about getting out of the EU and getting out from under the euro. But the consequence of that would have been, I think, a Greek economy where inflation was running wild, and it would have been just as deep or deeper of a crisis than what they were already facing. It would not have necessarily solved anything to make that move.
Mm-hmm. I would agree.
Yeah. So this multipolar world in terms of currencies, these currencies aren't going to overcome this basic problem that you have to wildly speculate about future productive profits in order to justify loans and credit.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that would happen. Yeah. You would have to do that whether it's the ruble or the yen or the dollar.
Yeah. As long as we remain in a form of production organized on capitalist lines. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, this turn to like a nationalist politics to solve the problem of just on the economic side is a way to, like, I don't know. It seems to me to be a way to not solve the problem. It's like,
I would go further. I mean, I would say it's a way to accelerate the catastrophe we're heading towards, which is the formation of belligerent. I mean, it's not, I don't want to, nothing is set in stone, right? For sure. Like, I don't want to suggest that, but I mean, definitely the winds are blowing towards a kind of deglobalized global economic order, a world economic multipolar order that is based on different zones of influence, zones of economic interest, maybe at some point different currency zones, although that I think that remains some time away, but who knows at this point. And yeah, it's rooted in, I would say, it's all rooted in the inability of the global productive system to produce enough surplus value for the companies that reside, the private companies and that employ people that reside in all the the major powers. And so then all of the great powers have to continually use state intervention and state policies to keep economic growth going on an ever more intense and larger scale. And I would argue the more that we see this process of kind of fusion between national governments and their private economic sectors to keep driving growth, the more we're going to see this trend towards the kind of like future scenario you're describing, where like the powerful states feel that they can no longer be dependent or economically dependent on each other, and it's more just kind of up to their state apparatuses to drive growth in their national economies. And the further that process, I mean, so it would be neo-imperialism, basically. Like, this is my argument, is that we're moving into a kind of neo-imperialist moment, where this is the kind of objective trend that we see basically all the major capitalist powers moving towards. And it does not bode well, to put it lightly.
yeah.
And so it wouldn't solve the problem, and I think it's really pushing us further down that road, I would say.
Yeah. Listen, we've been talking for about 50 minutes. I usually try to get like 2 sessions of recording, one for the general public, one for patrons. Do you have a little bit more time? Because I'd like to talk to you about why it is that the left, particularly in the last 30 years, hasn't been able to take in this understanding and develop a politics to respond to it, or what do you think needs to be done? Do you have time to have that conversation?
I don't think I have another full hour, but I can probably go for like another half hour, if that works.
Okay, let's do that.